Hello, everyone. Happy Holi. I hope you all had a very safe and colorful Holi today. My name is Sanskar from Mexili. Welcome to another episode on our Spring of Code channel. And we have a very special guest today. We have Stephen Frost from Postgres. Hi, Stephen. Would you like to
Hello.
introduce yourself?
I'm Stephen Frost. I'm a major contributor and committer on the Postgres project. I also work for a company called Crunchy Data that does a lot with Postgres. I'm the chief technology officer there.
Nice, Stephen. We are very glad to have you on the channel. So today we'll be talking about Postgres and Stephen's journey throughout open source and the importance of open source and the kinds of project that Stephen contributes to. So maybe Stephen, would you like to talk about the organization of Postgres as a whole and maybe the projects that you all contribute to?
Yeah, absolutely. Primarily I contribute to Postgres. I have contributed to some other open source projects in the past. I have code in the Linux kernel. I have code in SendMail. I have code in other projects as well. But I've really spent about the past 20 years working principally with Postgres. Postgres is a project that's been around for a very long time. It actually started out of California, actually, in the U.S. in a university working with Michael Stonebreaker, and this was about 30 years ago. And Postgres was actually named Postgres because it came after another project that Stonebreaker worked on, which was called Ingres. So his whole idea was that it's post Ingres. Ingres was actually, interestingly enough, more graph oriented. But they were starting to get really into relational technology, and that's where Postgres was born out of. The Postgres project today principally works with mailing lists. So that's one thing that if you're going to be working with the Postgres project, you'll want to be familiar with, and I'll go over a little bit about that later. Almost everything that happens in the Postgres community today is principally driven by the committers and the different teams that work inside of Postgres. So we have a team of committers. This is about 20 or so people right now, some of whom are more active, some of whom are less active. The more active committers tend to be folks who are actually working for companies that are working on Postgres, right? And there are a number of different companies that work on Postgres today. And so these are people who are actually hired full-time to just work on improving Postgres and making it better. But we also have a large number of people who contribute outside of that kind of core group of committers. These are folks who submit patches, do translation work on various teams. We have a security team it's basically comprised of committers who have been around for a very long time, as well as a few folks from what's called the core team. So we also have a core team in Postgres. The core team actually does not get involved in technical discussions or technical decisions, really. The core team is there more for kind of management of the overall project, but they don't drive feature work. They don't make technical decisions. All of that's done really by the committers, right? Those are the folks who are really driving the technical decisions. But everything is actually very open in Postgres. We have discussions and dialogues, and there are people who will get on the mailing lists and just comment on one particular aspect of something, right? And generally speaking, we're very receptive and very open to having that kind of a dialogue with anybody who's interested in working on Postgres or in contributing to Postgres. It's actually a very active community. So I would say we probably, every Postgres release has maybe 200 distinct people who are involved in making it work and bringing that particular release together.
That's so awesome. We have a lot of, so maybe first of all, can you share the mailing list link so that the people who are joining the stream can refer to and start discussing about Postgres? And
Sure, absolutely. So the link to the mailing lists is actually the best place to go really is kind of starting in our archives. So we actually have a large archive that we maintain. So I'm not sure. I'm sharing that screen. I don't know if you want to bring that up, but we can certainly talk about it.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is our archives for the mailing list, and we also have some kind of initial tips there about how to use our mailing lists. So we have a archive policy, mechanism for subscribing and unsubscribing, and then we have these really big archives. Now, the one that is probably going to be most interesting to people who are interested in actually contributing to Postgres is this hackers list down here, right? So the Postgres hackers list really is an amazing mailing list. It is extremely busy. There are, literally typically like hundreds of emails a day that are hitting this mailing list. So, I mean, just as an example, you can see here, I mean, it's the 29th, right? And we're already up to quite a few emails happening on, on this date, going between all kinds of different things about, can we avoid joins, right? Can we add support for, concurrent abort callback, right? There's all kinds of interesting things here. When it comes to actually contributing to Postgres, again, getting on these mailing lists is certainly a good approach. But there's a couple of other things that we have that I wanted to show. The first one is that if you actually want to submit a patch to Postgres, you have some bit of change that you want to make to the Postgres core code, right? When I'm talking about Postgres here, principally I'm focusing on the database backend server. There's a lot of different projects that are involved in Postgres. Basically, all of them are open source. So, if you wanted to go work on our website, for example, that's an open source project available, and you can go download the code for our website and see it, and certainly get onto our mailing lists. That our website actually is a different mailing list. It's www. And you can see that in our archive. So, but what I'm talking about here principally is the core code, right? So when you want to contribute to the core code of Postgres, the first thing really, unless it's just a trivial patch, right? If it's a bug fix, or like a typo fix or something, those are usually pretty easy. That you can just basically send it to that hacker's mailing list, and typically somebody will pick it up and work with it, right? Anything that's a larger change, something that's not trivial, is something that we really recommend getting discussion about first, right? Because you want to make sure that the design of the feature makes sense, right? And I like to design the interface first, right? So the interface is what's the actual syntax for a particular command. Right. If you want to invent a new command, you have to typically invent some kind of new syntax for it. Right. And what does that syntax look like? What are the semantics of it? Are things to decide up front, right from the get-go.
So, Stephen, what would be a non-trivial fix? Maybe you can share us an example with the community.
So a non-trivial kind of change might be, so as an example, one that was recently committed was actually a patch to allow Postgres to use different methodologies for compression, right? That was a pretty significant and nice change, right? So that was committed recently. That'll be included in Postgres 14. So Postgres has for a very long time the ability to and the automation actually to compress any object that's larger than a certain size, right? So if you have like 2K of data, we're going to automatically compress that for you. And in fact, in most cases, we're going to even store that in a side table, right? But the compression algorithm that we had originally included in Postgres was good for some things and not good for other things. So it's nice that we now have the ability that coming up in the 14 release that'll be released this fall, you'll actually be able to pick alternative compression, right? So you can say for this particular column, I want to compress this data using a different algorithm, right? And initially, I think it was LZ4, but I anticipate that we're going to have other compression algorithms added. So that would actually be, potentially an interesting first patch for someone to work on, would be to, now that we have all of the infrastructure there, adding on other compression options is likely not to be very difficult. And so that would potentially be a good thing to start out with if somebody was interested in working on that. But of course, you want to get on the Postgres hackers mailing list and basically ask people, hey, is anybody already working on this? Or is this something that I could write a patch for and submit it to have it included in Postgres?
Right. That's absolutely right. We don't ever want to have collisions or conflicts in the open source community.
Oh, it
And
happens.
yeah, yeah. So
But
Stephen
it's
talked.
okay. You can work through it, but it's better if we can avoid anybody doing kind of duplicate work. I've certainly gone out and written patches myself that ended up not being included in Postgres because somebody came up with a better design and a better approach and submitted a different patch to do it a different way. And you know what? It happens, and it's all right, right? Sometimes even just bringing something up spurs somebody to go do something. Actually, one of my recent patches that was a relatively small patch, but is, I would say, a pretty interesting and neat performance improvement, was speeding up analyze. So one of the things that Postgres does all the time in the background is running this analyze command to go gather statistics about the data that's in the database, right?
Okay.
And what I did was somebody had brought up this question of like, well, we'd really like to figure out what analyze is doing all this time, right? Sometimes it takes a long time for analyze to run. We're not sure what's going on. And I went and looked at it and I went, okay, well, that's great, right? And I want to support this. And I that was the first patch I ended up committing in this kind of sequence of patches, was just to add in additional logging information about what analyze was doing. But then the other thing I realized was, you know what? The way analyze works is that it actually kind of skips through the table, right? And that works very much against the kernel's normal read ahead, right? Normally you go read a page, the kernel says, okay, well, if you read that page, you're probably going to want to read the next couple pages, right? We don't do that with analyze. With analyze, we skip through it, right? It's very similar to a bitmap heap scan, or also known as like a skipping scan, right? Well, for a long time with our bitmap heap scans, we've had this code in there that would tell the kernel, hey, kernel, I don't want the next page. I want this other page, right? Like 10 pages away. There's no reason why you can't do the same thing with analyze. And that's what I did. So I went and added this ability to use POSIX fadvise to actually implement, informing the kernel when we're doing an analyze of what pages we're going to actually want, right? And that sped up analyze in a tremendous amount in certain instances where the pages are not already inside of shared buffers or already available, right? Because now the kernel can go get that page that we're going to ask for in half a millisecond, right, after we're done processing the current page, right? And it can have that page ready for us, and that tremendously speeded up analyze, which is actually really important in a number of cases.
Right, absolutely. So, Stephen, we have one question
Sure.
from the community, that what would be an initial approach for someone who has learned Postgres but is new to open source? And adding to that question, I would like to ask, is there any prerequisite of technology, or what kind of technology should a person know before contributing to Postgres?
So Postgres, as I said before, there's a lot of different projects and sub-projects. But when it comes to the question of if you want to hack on the actual Postgres backend code, right, that's almost entirely in C, right? So when it comes to languages and languages that you're looking to work with, if it's the backend code, it's going to be C. And of course, understanding SQL is important if you're going to be changing any of the SQL syntax. That's obviously an important aspect as well. But principally, it would be C code. I've actually got a couple of talks that I've given before that have been recorded and are up on YouTube called Hacking Postgres. So those are some talks that I can send some links for them later on if you'd like, that I've given at different conferences that actually talk about and go through an entire patch of like, here is a example patch and what ended up happening to it. And that actually goes into a lot of things like memory management, for example, in Postgres.
Right.
Postgres uses what are called memory contexts a lot. And so that's an important aspect whenever you're hacking on the back end to be familiar with.
Right, absolutely. So I hope, Parthiv, you have gotten an answer to your question. Thank you, Stephen, for answering this one. So how can the beginners start contributing to it? I believe that C is a little, let's say, uh, scary for the beginners, or people usually nowadays tend to start off with Python or JavaScript on their
So
coding journey.
when it comes to just starting out with Postgres and working with the community in general, one of the things that I wanted to highlight here is something called our CommitFest app. So this CommitFest app is something I think is a bit unique to Postgres, but you can kind of imagine it as being similar to GitHub issues or GitHub pull requests, right? So this is a list of all of the patches that are currently being considered to be included in core Postgres. So one of the things that you can do with this is actually go, and as you can see here, there's a lot of things that are in needs review, right? So
Okay.
one way to start out with open source projects and to start out with Postgres in particular is to go do patch review, right? You don't actually have to write your own patch to contribute to Postgres. You can just take an existing patch that someone else has written and download it and work with it yourself and provide a review of that patch. And in fact, we actually have out on the wiki, and I will bring that link up too, because that would be nice for people to see, of how to review a patch, right? So there's actually a patch review. There it is. Let me bring this over here. And I will show that to you also. So this talks all about what it is to review that patch, right? And I'll paste this link in here for you also, so you can include that. So, this is a nice way to start out with Postgres, where rather than starting out actually having to write your own patch or write your own code or anything, you just go to the CommitFest application. You download the patch basically, and then you can apply that patch locally and test it, right? And that's actually a really nice thing to do that helps the community out a whole bunch and starts to get you familiar with the Postgres code base,
Yeah,
which is obviously a really important aspect if you're thinking about contributing to Postgres.
absolutely. And this is exactly the way I kind of started my open source journey as well. I was very acquainted. I knew Python from the surface, but however, to learn the best practices of a language and to know about the core features, one really has to read someone else's code. People who are obviously more experienced than them have contributed to production quality code. So this contributing this way has basically two advantages. One, you definitely help community because we are always in need of people who review code than the people who actually write code. And the second is you get to know about the best practices that are actually involved, and you basically help yourself as well so that you write better quality code.
Absolutely. And I just want to highlight here, right? Currently in this CommitFest, there are 118 entries, 118 different distinct patches that are in the needs review state, right? There's, the way that this kind of works through is what happens is that a patch first gets submitted in a needs review state. And then ideally we have someone who is not a committer, right? We have somebody else in the community who comes in and provides a review of that patch, right? They download it, they test it, they make sure it works, and addresses whatever it is that they think, that whatever it's intended to address, right? And once it's gone through that cycle a little bit, so typically it goes needs review and then waiting on author is typically what happens, right? Because that review produces some changes, right? And then it goes, then a new patch is submitted and it goes back to needs review. And after a couple of those cycles, eventually it gets to a point where the reviewer and the patch author are in agreement and everybody's happy with it. and then they can go and mark it what's called ready for committer, right? So that's the next level. So you can see here we have 29 patches currently outstanding in that ready for committer queue. Okay, so now we have 29, almost 30 patches that are actually ready for someone, for one of the actual committers of Postgres to go review. And at that point, it can either go back to waiting on author if the committer saw something that they wanted changed or improvements that they wanted to see made, or it can go to the next state, which is committed, right?
Okay.
So committed here said these are patches that have actually been committed into Postgres and are going to be included in our next release, right? This commit fest, right? This commit fest that started at the beginning of this month has already got 78 patches that have been committed to Postgres. Postgres is a very active project, right? When I talk about hundreds of emails a day, I'm not kidding, right? Like, we are extremely active. Sometimes we have cases where, basically at the end of a commit fest, and sometimes ahead of time, we decide that, okay, this is not a patch that's going to make it into this next release. And at that point, we'll typically move that patch to the next commit fest, right? Or we might return the patch with feedback if there's some reason why, it's not going to make it right now. Occasionally, we have cases where a patch might be rejected, which really means it was probably something that was maybe an approach that we didn't want to take, or was just something that didn't make sense for whatever reason. And then we actually have patches that a patch author could withdraw a patch too. But as you can see here, for this month, we have a total of 300 almost patches that are in consideration to be worked on in and to be included in Postgres. And that's just this commit fest, right? So we actually stagger commit fests. There's it depends on the year. We've had different numbers of commit fests. It's typically 4 or 5, and it's kind of every other month kind of idea for commit fests. And in fact, we can go back up here and you can see all of the past commit fests and all the different patches that are in them, going all the way back to when we started with this particular app, which was back in 2014.
Okay, awesome. So do we have a fixed frequency of the commit fest, or they're kind of like a random way on how you decide when a commit fest should occur?
So commit fests are on a schedule, right? And we typically announce that schedule every year. Generally speaking, it's March, January. I'm kind of going backwards because that's how I think of it, right? But here I can just show you, right? So then so we have the March one now. The next one that we're planning to do is in July, and then September, and then almost certainly the one after that will be November, and then January, and then March. As I said, it's kind of about every other month. We're in a really interesting time right now because Postgres is nearing feature freeze. So we've already announced feature freeze for Postgres. And so that's going to be basically, at the beginning of April, we're going to actually call feature freeze. And at that point, that's kind of the deadline for everybody who wants a feature in the next version of Postgres. So the next major version of Postgres slated to come out in September. That's going to be version 14. So we're going to go into this feature freeze point, here at the beginning of April, and then between April and September, we're going to be working on 14, right? Making improvements to it, asking people to test it. There'll be some beta releases in there. Usually, we'll do a beta release kind of in the May or early June timeframe. So you kind of get this, everybody kind of gets their initial set of patches in right before feature freeze, and then usually there's some work after that. And we actually have a release management team that manages a lot of that work to make sure that all of the issues that have been identified get addressed. Once we get down to a small set of remaining issues, hopefully 0, we'll actually put out a beta. And again, that happens in a usually kind of late May, early June timeframe. And once we've kind of gotten into that beta phase, that's where we start to look at the next major version, right? And that's where that July commit fest comes into play. That's going to be our commit fest. It's going to be our first commit fest for the V15, right? The Postgres 15 major version release set. And what we encourage is if people have larger patches or larger amounts of work that they're doing, try to get those into the queue earlier in the cycle. So really, if you're thinking about a big new feature for Postgres, you should be working on that for the July commits fest, right? And targeting version 15. And in fact, you'll even see in here, we have a version column, and this indicates which version we're targeting. So you see a lot of these are going to be v14, right? But there'll be some in here that are 15, right? So let's see if I can find one. I mean, not a big deal, but some of these patches are going to actually be slated for version 15 already. And usually those are ones, so there's an example, right? So this one is slated for version 15. And so it might not get a lot of work in this commit fest because a lot of us are focusing on trying to get everything into 14 that we can. But you can even bring in patches and ask us to take a look at them, even for farther out releases. And we're typically pretty happy to do so.
Got it. Awesome. So we have a very interesting question by Soumya. So, Stephen, if someone asks you what should I choose, Postgres as a database or something else, what would be your answer?
So I would say that, we just go back to here. The world's most advanced open source relational database. By and large, Postgres is actually, it's extremely performant. It handles large write loads really well. It handles large read loads really well. It's been under development for, as I said, 30 years, right? So it's been a long time, right, that we've been working on it and improving it and making it that much better. But a lot of times, one of the things you have to consider is, what are you familiar with, right? So if you're just starting out, I definitely encourage you to look at Postgres and also to look at SQL as a language as something that you probably want to consider investing some time in if you want to work with a lot of data, right? Because it really is a great language for that. I mean, it's not perfect. Every language has its flaws, but the ability to do normalization is a huge benefit when it comes to working with a large amount of data. And that is amazing because you can eliminate duplication. It's almost like custom compression, right? Which is amazing. In the ability to do that, and Postgres is really, really good at it, and working with a good data model. So I would say, there are use cases for certainly other types of databases. Postgres is not, the one big, come all, but it handles a huge number of use cases, right? I probably not a surprise. I kind of default to Postgres, right? In fact, all of the systems that you're looking at, from our wiki to our website to the CommitFest app, all of those run, of course, on Postgres, right? It really gets to be a question of if you have some very specialized requirement where maybe Postgres doesn't solve that very well, maybe that's a reason to look at an alternative. But by and large, Postgres handles a huge swath of use cases. And I'll tell you, it's one of those things where if you can make it work with Postgres, it's typically going to be worthwhile because that's one less system you have to manage and deal with, right? A lot of people end up having this like core relational system that's kind of the bread and butter of their business or their infrastructure. And then they add on other things to it. And every single additional thing you add, you have to realize you need to worry about high availability, you need to worry about backup and maintenance, all of these pieces. So if you can do it in Postgres, it's a lot better just to start there and then figure out, okay, maybe I got to a point where this isn't working great in Postgres for whatever reason. Maybe you can do something different and it will work great in Postgres, or maybe you need to look at an alternative.
Yeah, absolutely. But mostly it's for the convenience of how the technology is usable, and SQL, almost every computer science student is taught SQL throughout the university. And since Postgres has this long 30-year backup support, so you have like a very vast community that can help you out if you get stuck anytime. So we have a question from Surya. Is Postgres suitable for unstructured data? I remember that we were able to add JSON strings in Postgres columns.
So
So
here's what I'll tell you about that, right? Postgres actually is great for unstructured data. It works very well because we have two different data types that we support. We support JSON, which is just pure string, right? But mind you, even with that pure string, we're going to compress it and store it out of line once it gets to be a larger size. But we also have a data type called JSON-B, right? Which is actually our own internal JSON representation that's actually binary and can be indexed, right? Which is fantastic. So we can have very, very fast indexing support for JSON data stored in Postgres. Now, I want to caveat all of that slightly. And the reason I want to bring this up is that when you start storing unstructured data, right, that implies that you must store things like what elements are a part of the data, right? You need to store all of the attributes. So not only do you have to store the values of those attributes, you have to store the names, right? So typically what happens is that you get a JSON structure or a JSON-B structure, and you have a whole bunch of names as well as a whole bunch of data points, but those names end up getting repeated over and over and over again, which is actually what ends up making unstructured data not very efficient as a methodology for storing data, because it's just physically larger, right? If you can pull out some of that unstructured, some of that data, right? Because not all of it is really unstructured, right? Every JSON has some kind of structure to it, right? It's not like every single element is a completely different set of data points, right? They typically have some structure. And one of the great things about Postgres is that you can have a structured set of columns, and then you can have the JSON in addition to that, right? And that really gives you the best of both worlds. So you can have that structured data pulled out as regular columns, right, which don't take up any storage to store the column names, because we store that in a catalog. We store just the values. And then for any of that other stuff that you have out there that you want to have that's actually unstructured and is distinct per row and whatnot, make that be what the JSON is. And that reduces the size of that JSON significantly. And we can still, with JSON-B, fully index it and provide really fast lookups for it.
Yeah, got it. So we hope, Surya, that we were able to answer your question. So we have another question. It's by Surya only. It's probably a little duplicate, but she's asking, apart from the uh, core Postgres functionalities, what are projects are available for the developers? Let's say like the website or the documentation.
Certainly, we are always looking for translators and folks to work on the documentation. Absolutely, all of our documentation is part of the main Git repo, so you can go look at that. It's actually in a doc directory, and it's all DocBook, right? It's not hard to work with at all. And so certainly, if you're interested in working with Postgres, then taking a look at the documentation and understanding how to make changes to it and to improve on that is certainly welcome. I'm actually, one of my next patches that I'll be committing here soon is actually purely a documentation improvement around addressing, basically making it easier to find features that have been obsoleted or renamed in older versions of Postgres. So absolutely, that's an area that we certainly would encourage, is looking at the documentation and understanding that. If you're looking at contributing to the Postgres project, then having an understanding of Python would be really helpful. Almost all of our websites are written in Django, right? So if you're familiar with Python and you know Django and you want to contribute to the Postgres project, that would be great. And those are kind of sub projects inside of the overall Postgres project that you could certainly consider contributing to and would absolutely be appreciated.
Awesome. And talking about these documentation updates, we all are aware that documentation updates are just never solely documentation updates, because you have to read a lot of code base to actually understand what to write documentation about, as well as you can contribute to Python projects and support on the websites that come under the Postgres repository. So we hope, Surya, we were able to answer your question. Yes. So, Stephen, we have one question that what are the do's and do nots while contributing, and what are do's and do nots while reviewing a patch? Like, what are the best practices of a person who can contribute to Postgres?
So
Like,
when it comes to doing a patch review, some of that is included here inside of the reviewing a patch, right? And it actually talks through a lot of, kind of what you need to do in terms of how you should review it, right? So we have kind of a submission review, a usability review, a feature test. These are the approaches that you can take to doing patch review. And this is kind of the approach we recommend, right? So you want to read what is the patch author saying the patch does, right? And then you want to download the patch, actually apply it to the code base, build Postgres with it, and then check, does it actually do that, right? Is this something that we actually, does it actually do what it says it does, right? That's one of the biggest things, is just making sure that it does that. And then if you can think about, are there ways that maybe it doesn't consider certain corner cases, right? So that's always a good thing to look at, right? Think about corner cases to look at. And if you see any assertion failures or crashes, definitely detail out how that happened, right? And actually make sure that you tell the patch author, like, this is what I did to get this crash, because that's really going to be very helpful to them. Sometimes performance review is important. Depending on if the patch is looking like it's going to slow down some things, or if it claims to speed things up. It's always good to get a wide variety of tests to see if that happens. And then there's also a lot of things here inside of we actually have project coding guidelines. So you can check to see, does the patch actually follow the coding guidelines that are detailed here? And I'll bring that up too, so you can see. Well, that's interesting. All right. So apparently that is not, I'm going to go fix that link. So the coding guidelines, I think, have moved. So I'll get you the link for them. But we do have project coding guidelines that are up on the main website. So that's something that you can go look at. One of the other things that's always interesting is portability issues. So if you're comfortable developing on and working with code on Windows, for example, that's something we always need people to be testing with. Right. Most of the Postgres hackers are on some form of Unix. I would say the majority of us are on Linux. Some of us are also on like FreeBSD, but not as many of us are on Windows. And so we certainly would recommend that if anybody is familiar with and comfortable building a product the size of Postgres on Windows, that's a great way to help out. Testing patches on Windows is really helpful to us.
yes, absolutely. So we have an appreciation comment from Harsh that Postgres is his go-to database, and he just wants to thank you all for making it so simple and efficient. So out of curiosity, Stephen, how did you start with your open source journey? How did you start contributing in open source and Postgres?
Oh, that's a great question. It's a great question. So I actually started out, I started working in high school, right? So secondary education, however you want to phrase it, right? In high school, which is, so I would have been 16 or so, 16 years old. And so around that time, I started working for a internet service provider, right? This is a small internet service provider way back, right? And I started learning about Unix, right? And learning about all these different commands and all the capabilities of Unix systems. And it was around that time that I learned about the different operating systems that were free and open source. And I was also taking classes, I was taking a class in C in high school at the time. I got very, very interested in the actual code behind all of these operating systems and everything else. And so I started working and started looking at them. So I started out actually on BSDI, which was a commercial Unix variant that was used at my work at the time. And then I got into FreeBSD kind of initially, and then I moved over from FreeBSD to Linux, as I think a lot of people did, mostly for driver support, right? The computers that I was buying, I had better driver support in Linux. And at that point, that's when I started hacking on the Linux kernel itself. So I actually wrote a couple of patches for Linux. It was maybe a little bit early on in my Linux career. I'm pretty sure that all of my patches in Linux have now been completely rewritten. I know this for at least one of them because I invented the IP tables module called IPT recent. That was actually mine. I wrote that originally way back when, and I know it's been rewritten because there were definitely issues with it. And then I moved companies. I started working with another company doing principally C and C++ development. And then I started getting involved and I started learning relational database technology. Started out with commercial database systems, of course, as most people did back in, it would have been around 96 or so. I started working with commercial database systems, and I really enjoyed working with Linux, right, and being able to actually hack on the code. And so, after a couple of years of working with the commercial systems, I got tired of it, and I started looking for an open source relational database. And I ended up finding Postgres and getting involved in the Postgres project. And I basically got that the department that I was working in for that company to move everything off of the commercial database systems and onto Postgres eventually, which was I don't know. I was really happy about that that migration. Let me tell you.
Yeah, absolutely. We all actually, even I as well, really enjoy embracing the free and open source movement. All my projects and all my machines, I try to install everything first. Out of curiosity, which kind of Linux distro do you use, Stephen?
Oh, this is probably not that interesting, right? So here's what I'll tell you. I run Ubuntu for my laptop, right? And again, this is driver support and things like that. I will tell you, though, I work a great deal with Debian. In particular, all of the Postgres infrastructure runs on Debian. I do also do a fair bit of work, particularly with my day job, as you put it, with Red Hat. So I do a lot with RHEL as well. But at least on my laptop, I run Ubuntu, and then I run Debian for all of the Postgres infrastructure.
All right, awesome. So, do you have any advice for the people who are beginning with the open source journey or just contributing to Postgres? Maybe like a broad advice that you can give to people starting out with first.
So I think the broad advice that I would give is when you're working in these open source communities, I really encourage everyone to think of it as it's at least for many of us, it's part of our job, right? And so certainly whenever you're working in those environments, it's really important to just stay professional and be professional. That's one of the things that we care about a lot in Postgres. We take great pride in saying that our community is a very professional, very very good community to work in. And one of the other parts about that is feedback that you get from us is from the Postgres community tends to be direct and it's not a bad thing, right? It's direct, it's to the point, and it's something that I encourage people to really look at as we're trying to help, right? Any feedback that you get about your patch, about this or that, is just our way of trying to provide guidance and provide suggestions and help on ways to improve, right? It's very rare for us to come out and say, no, we don't want this, or no, we don't want that. But even in that case, it's usually going to be done in a manner that says, hey, this is why we don't think this particular thing makes sense or isn't the direction that we think the project should be going in. And so we really try to provide constructive feedback. And so I encourage everyone who's working in open source to always be thinking about how can you provide constructive feedback? How can you provide feedback that is going to be, something that someone can take and then work with, right? It's valuable to be direct and to be technically correct, right? That's always important. But, try to do it in a way that is encouraging and gives people feedback that they can actually take action on and do something to change whatever it is that they're doing or whatever they're working on to be more in line with what makes sense for the project that you're working with.
Right, absolutely. So I hope this answers your question, Javed, that is it advisable for the beginners to contribute in this? It is definitely advisable for anyone to contribute to the project. as long as you maintain a particular level of professionality. And if you are a beginner, you will definitely get more exposure to contributing to large projects, because as a beginner, you don't get enough opportunity to contribute to large code bases. And contributing to Postgres, you will get a way on how you handle large code bases, how you deal with people, how you take and give feedback, which is, I believe, a really important skill to have early on in your career.
One of the things that
So
can help with all of that is if you subscribe to our mailing lists, subscribe to the Hackers mailing list, and read the emails that we send to each other, right? And you'll start to get that sense of how we work with each other, right? A lot of things that we do on there are, we kind of go point by point. And this is one of the other things, at least in particular for the Postgres project, is the way that we look at every email is that we kind of take them apart and we respond in line to particular comments or to particular aspects of a patch. And that's all done in a manner that allows people to kind of follow the thread, right? And
yeah,
so that's one of the other things that you'll notice when you're looking at the Postgres mailing lists is everything is kind of point by point. And that's how we would recommend anybody who's coming to our mailing list look at kind of trying to follow in the same kind of guidelines, same approach to responding to email, just because it really helps the reader a lot, right? One of the things that I think has really become missing in a lot of email communication today is being able to see what the point was that you were responding to. So the emails that you'll see posted to the Hackers mailing list typically are many, many hundreds of lines, right? And if you just respond to that 100 or 200 line email with a comment at the top that says, whatever it is, like what in that, 100 or 200 line email were you actually referring to, right? With that comment, like, this doesn't look okay to me. Well, what, right? What are we talking about? What are we referring to? It doesn't work very well. And that's one of the things that I think is an unfortunate reality in a lot of email communication today. So, subscribe to the mailing lists, watch the traffic for a while, get a feel for how we all communicate and how the emails are structured. And once you've done that, that's when, take a patch that's on the CommitFest app that needs a review, download it, provide a review, write it all up and send it to the Hackers mailing list. That's a great way for a beginner to start. And it really helps the community out a lot to have more people doing patch review.
yes, most definitely. Patch review is something that we all really want people in our communities to do that, because it's a little time consuming, and it's also a little difficult task to read someone else's code, but it really teaches you a lot.
Absolutely.
So Parthiv is asking, does Postgres have a Discord community? I guess Postgres mostly talks on email through the mailing list.
Yes, principally the Postgres community works on the mailing lists. You can find a number of us on Slack. So we have a Postgres Slack. We also have the Postgres IRC channel. For those of you who want to go way back, but a number of us are actually, in fact, working on Postgres, and we are using IRC to communicate, and we also use Slack to communicate. So those are some great channels. I do think someone has started a Discord community, but I'm not on it. I'm not familiar with it. I tend to be on Slack and IRC myself. And of course, a great deal on the mailing list. So I really encourage getting on the mailing list and following the mailing lists and reading the mailing list archives, right? There's a lot in our mailing list archives that you can certainly go read about and check out.
Right. Also, I remember using IRC as a kid made me look cooler in my friend circle. So if you want to do that, definitely join their
Yeah,
IRC.
we're on Freenode in particular. In fact, there is actually a on the Postgres website. There's actually there's this community link that you can certainly go look at. And here you can see there's some directions to the mailing list, to IRC, right? And so you can see the different channels that we have on Freenode, and you can also go to the Slack, and you can put in that if you want to log into our Slack community. Here, I can put that link into here too. I'll add that into the private chat for you.
Awesome. I'll just share it with the community.
Another thing, yeah, actually, I should point this out too, is Planet Postgres. So if you're interested, sorry about the tiny font. If you're interested in following along about things that are happening in the Postgres community, this is a blog aggregator that we have that brings together a whole bunch of blogs together and talks a lot about the different things that people are working on, different things that are happening inside of the Postgres community. So following planet.postgresql.org is also a great idea if you're interested in the project.
Yeah, here's the link, and you can definitely take a look at this link. All right, I guess we can answer some of the pending questions that we have. And
Sure.
If the community has any more questions, we do encourage you to ask them. And do follow Stephen on his Twitter. He really posts some informative stuff on there. And Stephen, what are the other ways that the community can contact you?
So I'm pretty easily available through my email, which I've had for a long time, which is why I have a cool domain. So you're welcome to send me an email to sfrost@snowman.net. That's a great way. I'm actually if you get on the IRC channel, I have my nick there is actually Snowman on IRC. On Slack, I'm sfrost. If you get on the Postgres Slack. So there's certainly a lot of different ways, and netsnow, as you know, is my Twitter handle. You can certainly send me tweets there as well. I'm always interested in hearing from people who are interested in Postgres, interested in working on the Postgres project.
Yes, definitely. Do reach out to Stephen, and he really imparts some valuable information on his Twitter. And let's see if we have any other questions left. And so we already answered this question. Any resources to start contributing? We'll be posting the links here in the video description. And we have already told what will be one's initial approach for someone who has learned Postgres but is new to open source. Try being involved in the communities, try learning how the community works, try learning the technology that is involved for the project, and do not ever hesitate to ask questions. People really value good questions, and learning how to ask good questions is a valuable skill and can save a lot of time throughout a person's career. And guess that's it. So, Stephen, do you have any final words for the community?
I would say, and in particular, if you're looking to make a good connection with the Postgres community, I strongly encourage you to get on the mailing lists, right? See what's happening, and watch the discussion going back and forth. Technologies, again, Git, C, we use Makefiles, so autoconf, automake are always things that, if you're familiar with that, it's going to be helpful. But just in general, with any community, right? As you said, get familiar with how they work, how they operate. If they use mailing lists or if they use GitHub or whatnot. There's certainly a lot of other projects around Postgres that use GitHub. There's some that use GitLab, right? There's some, there's a lot of different ways that one can get involved with different communities, and in particular with Postgres. But yeah, figure out how that community works, right? And I would encourage everyone to get involved in projects that are interesting to you. Right. I think that's an important angle, right? So I've always been interested in data. I've always been interested in making, in working with large data sets and being able to do performant working with it, right? And be able to do lots of analysis. And that's really how I got into databases in the first place, was working with large data sets and running analytics across them principally, right? A lot of analysis work. And that's what that was really what got me interested in Postgres in general. And A lot of the work I've done has been around different areas of Postgres, although I would say principally I deal with the security aspects of Postgres more than other parts. But yeah, absolutely, get involved in the project, get on the mailing lists, and that's going to be your best way to get involved with open source, with any open source project, but certainly Postgres in particular.
Yes, definitely. And do look out for projects that make you drive towards it and that make you really passionate about. Okay, Stephen, we have a really great question. Which ID does Stephen use?
So I use Vim. I mean, that's
Same.
my take on it. That's what I use. I've been using it for many years. I will tell you there are an awful lot of Emacs users in the Postgres community. So we have them both, I promise, right? And there are people who use other things too, I'm sure, but principally I use Vim myself.
Yes.
Always
We can
a fun question to ask.
we can all agree that unarguably Vim is the best ID to ever exist. All
I
right.
would say that again, getting familiar with Git is also just, I mean, almost everything these days is using Git, and so really understanding branches, understanding merges, understanding squashing commits, like all the so Postgres, one of the things that we do, we actually actively work to keep the Postgres code base actually clean on a commit by commit basis, right? So
Okay.
all these patches that come in that get reviewed and get go back and forth, right? Those individual minor commits don't even go into our main source tree, right?
Right.
All of that gets handled externally, maybe on somebody else's personal GitHub or whatever. By the time it actually goes into Postgres, we actually do squashed commits, right? Where we want everything that's associated with one particular feature or capability to go in at once, right? As long as it isn't, too big, right? Sometimes things can get to be too large for that to work out reasonably well. But generally speaking, we want to have commits that go into Postgres so that somebody can literally just read our commit log and get an understanding of it, right? If you have a commit log that's got bazillions of commits of all kinds of little tiny things, it becomes really hard to read that commit log. So we'll actually take like typos and whatnot that are, we'll actually batch those, right? Sometimes we'll do one-offs, but it's not uncommon for us to do like, well, we're going to take a batch of typos and commit them all at once so that it's just one commit rather than 15 commits or whatnot. So we really like to keep the tree clean. And I encourage that actually for all projects. I find that to be a far better way of working with a source tree personally. So I would encourage folks to do that as well.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Deepyan. Thank you for being a great audience. And
yeah, thank you for all the questions. This has been really fun to do.
Yes, absolutely. So I guess that's it. Thank you everyone for joining the community. Thank you, Stephen, for being such an amazing speaker. And I hope you all enjoy your free and open source journey. And I hope Postgres gets some good contributors out of the Code for Cause community.
That would be great. And I mean, one of these days we're going to have conferences again. And I encourage you to check out the community Postgres conferences. And that's where you'll find me once these things are happening again. And I'd love to meet people. I always love talking to new people about Postgres too.
Yes, it's always amazing to meet people in person, and especially these usernames when they convert to faces.
Indeed. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. All right then. Bye-bye, community.